Hey there, everyone. Today I have something a little bit different. A booktuber that I really like, Read Red, put out a new book tag of sorts, which is a sort of informal Q&A called Reflections in Authors. And it's a series of questions regarding authors, very kind of idiosyncratic but cool questions that I thought might be interesting for y'all to hear, just to see how I think about authors, what I think about them, maybe who some of my favorites are, so that if you share them as favorites, you can relate, and maybe if you've never heard of or read them, I can compel you to check them out. But that being said, let's just get straight into it. Now, before I get into these 10 questions, I must say that most of these questions could be answered with multiple authors, especially like Joyce and Nietzsche. I could probably put in all or almost all of these categories, but I tried to kind of whittle it down to the authors that I thought most suited the answers of each of these questions. But the first question is, which author do you think most embodies the idea of the author? Now, the author is, of course, laden with a lot of stereotypes and presuppositions, but when I think about the author, I think of someone who comes to writing as a bit of an escape or getaway from a hard life. It is some way to fulfill a desire in the face of imminent danger or threat. They've gone through a lot of hardships and haven't been given life to them per se, and yet they can create this aesthetic artifice that stands unto itself, that allows their artistic image to transcend any particular historical moment. You know, think of people like Milton or Shakespeare or Chaucer or Homer, right? These people, their names just speak to the entirety of at least Western culture, whatever we want to call that, if not the world. But these people have such a gravitas, right? That they can sort of transcend beyond any moment. And the author also values language in a very particular way. It's very different from how most kind of everyday people think about language. For most people, language is a tool, if it's ever really thought about, but it's not really something inherently valuable. But for the author, language is an extension of the voice in a very particular way, not because it allows content to get from here to here, but it delivers an affective experience. It is a bonding glue of sorts. It's the very essence of the human spirit, if I can say something so presumptuous. And the author that I think really embodies this is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a very hard life, battling these bouts of illness. Just kind of a general malaise followed him his entire life, but he would have these moments where for weeks on end he would be bedridden, feeling like he's on the verge of death. And then he would ascend out of these in moments of explosive ecstasy. And he could just still hold on to the enjoyment of life itself. He saw something valuable in change. And that's something that's really hard for people. It's hard for myself to learn to value, that change is inherently exciting and fulfilling, and it's what makes the clocks tick, right? Stasis is death, so the saying goes. And Nietzsche really didn't like stasis. He didn't like dogma. He didn't like institutions like the state. He didn't like, institutions like the university, for example, because of his sort of being outcast from the university. But I think Nietzsche just really stands as the kind of person who, when you read him, he embodies that authorial spirit that I find so enthralling about him. And the next question is, which author would you like to meet at a party and have only one conversation with them? And the way that Reed Radda answered this, it was kind of like, okay, you can only meet them at this one party. You can kind of have more than one conversation with them at this party, but like you'll never meet them again after this party. And I think I would have to say William Burroughs. William Burroughs is just an idiosyncratic, crazy guy. I mean, this sexual liberation, ecstatic Beat Generation American writer, sort of one of the defining voices of the 50s and 60s. And he struggled with drug addiction. He shot his wife on accident. He had this weird obsession with guns. He was kind of like into ESP and like altered states of consciousness and all this, kind of a very idiomatic person for the 50s and 60s in America, and kind of the progressivism, the extreme progressivism, basically to the point of anarchism, that defined that moment in culture. And Burroughs is the kind of person who I can't really see myself having a long-term relationship with him. He's just so unstable, for lack of a better word, and so extreme that I feel like I would get bored of it eventually. But when I do go to parties, which is rare, that's not the scene I typically am seen at, but when I do go to parties, I'm in the mood for, okay, I am here to kind of people watch and like have an eye-opening experience, just soaking in this like human conviviality. And I think with Burroughs, I would want to have this interaction with him while I was slightly high, because I think that would make it better. But I would just love to talk with Burroughs. I mean, I could talk with him about anything. I'd like to talk about the state and like anarchism and stuff like that. I would like to talk about politics, or about writing styles, or about pain or addiction, or something like suicide. I think he would just have so many interesting things to say about those, and I'm not really sure what he would say about all of them, because what I love about Burroughs is that he's kind of nonpartisan insofar as he doesn't hold himself to some label of, I am, insert identity category here. He kind of was beyond all that. At one point, he was asked whether he supported or was part of the gay liberation movement. And I mean, this was a man who liked other men as well as adolescent boys as well. But he said, I never have been gay or something like this. But we could tell by the way that he said that it was because he was shirking the label gay itself. The conventions that came along with kind of gay culture in the 50s and 60s, and how he wanted to distance himself from prescriptions. And I think that's something really powerful. I think he strikes me as someone who could ride by the seat of his pants and still enjoy it, and just enjoyed being unfettered. And that's something that I think appeals to me very much. The next question is, which author inspires the anxiety of influence in you? Now, the anxiety of influence is a concept from Harold Bloom, where you are so mesmerized by a certain author that their influence overtakes you, such that every time you write or act, you fear that you will be basically overshadowed by them. So you get this anxious relationship of kind of self-criticism and self-hatred, and it kind of plagues your creative life. I have two people for this that always kind of stand out to me as, oh, am I speaking or writing or thinking or presenting ideas as good as these people? That is Michel Foucault and Thomas Pynchon. Now, Foucault, I'm so enthralled by his originality when it came to this new historicism. I mean, granted, he was taking a lot of his influence from Nietzsche and the approach Nietzsche had to, the genealogical method. But the way that Foucault totally rips open the way that we think about concepts like madness or punishment or criminality or liberation or freedom or sexuality. He just totally has this historico-philosophical approach to everything that is so consistent. It's just a very intuitive way of breaking down these concepts that seem to be universal, is to pick apart where did they come from, how did they develop. For example, how did the notion of madness coincide with certain Christian norms or certain capitalistic norms? How did the form of modern punishment come about? And how did it come from something like state-sanctioned torture? And, is the new form of punishment really any less torturous in a certain sense, with its emphasis on vision and on knowledge and on tabulated understanding of every aspect of our lives? This is the kind of stuff that Foucault is just so thorough in the way that he looked at the world to deconstruct it down to elements that made things start to shine through and make sense. And that's something really appealing that I try to bring to in my work here, my work in university, etc. And then Thomas Pynchon, the way that he writes fiction is so intoxicating. It is a mix of intense philosophical and sociological and anthropological introspection and stylistic innovation and utter horror at some of the obscenities of the stuff that he writes. It's a literary experience that, it rivals hardly any author that I've ever read. And something about Pynchon just always looms over me. I just, all the time I think about random passages that connect to things I'm doing in my day, from Gravity's Rainbow or Mason and Dixon or Vineland or The Crying of Lot 49. Just these works have such an aura and they just go beyond themselves to such an extent. I just stand in awe all the time. I was rereading Gravity's Rainbow for the first reread, so my second read of Gravity's Rainbow a month or two ago, and I was just like, wow, how is it that I've already read this and still it just hits me with double the excitement and interest? And I just wonder, can anything I will ever do be as good as that? I think that is both a good and a bad thought to have in your head, this anxiety of influence. Next question, which author seems the most different to you as a person, yet you resonate with their works? I love this question. I think it's so interesting. I could put Burroughs here, and I was going to, but then it hit me. The Marquis de Sade is definitely the person I would put here. The Marquis de Sade is, of course, where we get the word sadism from, and he's obsessed with violence, punishment, retribution, pain, pleasure, sensation, liberation, freedom, slavery, bondage. Very, very interesting themes because they have so much more import than I think the Marquis de Sade may have realized. He uses these just fantastic escapades into the deepest, darkest pits of the human soul, of what can be put on a page. It's just, it sticks in my head, and I get these weird dreams every once in a while that I can tell are somewhat Sadian in their nature, not in their content, but in the way that they affect me. Some of the stuff just makes me disgusted, and that is a hard experience to really get. To truly be disgusted without having to actually see it. It's just told to you. And the language is not always particularly flowery, but it's also not smut either. The Marquis de Sade is a literary genius. Truly, truly a literary genius. I think Justine is a fantastic work of literature. It's kind of a reverse romantic depiction of the relationship between pleasure and pain and the throes that we're put into when we construct our lives around virtue instead of the very real necessity of considering oneself, and operating in one's best interests. And Sade has a lot of interesting things to say about religion and whatnot. So despite the fact that the Marquis de Sade engaged in a lot of these illicit sexual affairs, these orgies and coprophagia and all this just crazy stuff that I would never do. It's not appealing to me at all as something that I would want to do. But just to have someone take me into that world and know that I can kind of keep a distance from it, and yet I can still be fully immersed in this thing, it really is a testament to why I think that censorship laws are pretty stupid, generally speaking. I think if an author can manage to put something down on a page, it doesn't matter how explicit or controversial it is. I think that just experiencing those things in a controlled environment, which is what literature is, there's something transformative about that the Marquis de Sade really epitomizes for me. And despite my utter differences with him, I don't think we would get along very well in person because he's so extreme. Except maybe we would have some fun talks about religion and things like that. But I just think despite this difference, I find this affinity to the way that he talks about, for example, his theory of pleasure, where he says that pleasure has to do with the magnitude of a sensation, and that if pain can yield an incredibly concentrated sensation, one of the characters in Justine basically says, well, can you not imagine that this would bring someone pleasure? If you get pleasure from one of these experiences that you say are pleasureful, it's just because it happens to suit what you like and it does it to a certain magnitude. Can you not imagine that someone would find pain pleasureful? And it's a very interesting concept. I think there's something very perverse and yet interesting about de Sade and the kind of the veneer that coats his work. And then the next question is, which author would you like to meet simply to prove they're real? This is kind of a funny one. I was going to put Jesus here, honestly, because, we're pretty confident that Jesus existed. Maybe Muhammad would also be an interesting one. I would like to meet Muhammad just to see, what does this dude look like? Because you can't depict Muhammad. That would be really, really interesting. I'd like to sit down, eat some dates with Muhammad and talk about the mysteries of the universe. That would be super cool. But I put down Walt Whitman here because Whitman is just far back enough in history that we have pictures of him, but we don't have video. He's just lost enough to history that I need to know this dude in person. I need to know, I can see interviews with William Burroughs or with Foucault or Baudrillard or Deleuze. I can see these people. I know they existed. And I know Walt Whitman existed, but I need to know exactly in what respect. He kind of strikes me as, when you touch the skin of a grandparent and it just has a very unique allure. It's soft and comforting and maternal/paternal. I think Walt Whitman would be like that, funny enough. I would just want to touch the dude's face and be like, oh, yes, you're real, because I can just see this friendly comfort in his writing that I know I need to experience in real life. I feel like he would be so easy to be friends with. So that's that one. The next question is, what author do you find most seductive or enthralling in their incomprehensibility? I could put a lot of people on here, but in particular, I'm struck by the just awe-inspiring incomprehensibility of James Joyce, particularly in Finnegan's Wake. Right now, I'm rereading Finnegan's Wake, and I'm just astounded by the utter complexity that Joyce's language is able to have bread within it. I mean, no one quite understood the variety of inherent associations within language that Joyce was able to, and he brings that into Finnegan's Wake, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I could literally spend a lifetime rereading this book front to back, and I would not exhaust it. There would be more things that I'm confused about, and just like anytime I'm holding a copy of Finnegan's Wake in my hands, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it just like seethes with excitement and allure and confusion, and it seduces me. It truly seduces me. I'm happy to read it, and I'm happy when I don't understand something, because I can just appreciate the style, the sound, the feel, the affective, bodily experience of pronouncing it, of feeling it in my mouth. I mean, it's this very seductive experience. But also Thomas Pynchon. I've got to bring Thomas Pynchon back. I mean, the formal experimentation in Gravity's Rainbow is like peak fictional experimentation insofar as it's not quite as obscure as Finnegan's Wake, because just the way that Finnegan's Wake uses language is totally unique. I mean, no other work really does it. But like Gravity's Rainbow still has the kind of architecture that makes language work kind of normally, but it kind of the way that the language fits on the page, like there's kind of poems and songs and like journal entries and encyclopedia entries and stuff like that, and the way that he uses kind of certain phrases, or he puts in like Rilke quotes and stuff like that, just everything about that, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's so seductive, because I have no idea what he's saying sometime, but there are just these kind of intermeshing symbols of, the phallus and the V2 rocket, and oh my gosh, there's so many in Mason and Dixon too, with like the idea of maps and lines and the embodied nature of writing. Just so many interesting things that I'm like, I could just keep reading him over and over, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy. And then the next one, which author would you like to have as a teacher? Now this is a hard one, because I was really having to think about this, because there are a lot of authors that, like Joyce or Pynchon or Burroughs, I would not want to have them as a teacher. They're so much above me in terms of the way that they think about language, that I just have this intuition that they wouldn't be very good at teaching people. They might not be good at meeting me on my own grounds and kind of helping me improve as a thinker. Maybe Joyce would. Joyce kind of seems like a stand-up guy from what I know of him through books and whatnot. But I think Edward Said is someone that I could really see being a good teacher. The way Edward Said writes is so clear. I mean, it's not formulaic, but it's upfront yet nuanced and intriguing, and is able to interrogate fundamental concepts, but it doesn't do it with the kind of style of maybe some of his contemporaries like Derrida or Foucault. I know he was a little bit after these people, but kind of in terms of the work he's doing, it's very tangentially, if not directly related. And yet he presents things so clearly. So his writing style is really nice. And also I think he'd be really good at encouraging interdisciplinary study. Said was really good about combining philosophy and history and, kind of this cultural studies, like post-colonial studies / Middle Eastern studies kind of deal. And I think he'd be really good at kind of motivating that and bringing out in my work something exciting. I think interdisciplinary work is it's an exciting thing to know that I'm going to become a scholar at this time when there's so much new things that are happening in these different fields. So I think Said would be really good at kind of helping that kind of flower out of me. Now next, this was one of the hardest questions. Which author was the first to show you how unique or powerful a book could be? Now, I was going to put Joyce on here, and I was going to say Ulysses, because Ulysses really got me back into fiction and into, kind of literature, roughly speaking, because just the way that he incorporates style and stuff like that, language and this kind of rejoicing that's in Nietzsche, for example, I was just enthralled by. But I was thinking, okay, it's asking the first to show you how unique or powerful a book could be. And I have to choose Hegel. Now, I'm not a Hegelian. I disagree with a vast amount of Hegel. I'm fundamentally opposed to idealism, but the Phenomenology of Spirit was just a transformative work. I mean, I remember being kind of unsure about philosophy in my kind of later years of high school, and I was really getting interested in it, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was going to go into music, and I was going to maybe be a conductor or a orchestral musician. And then I read the Phenomenology of Spirit, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fantastic. I mean, it just had this fundamental kind of click change about the way that I approach the world. And I've had very few experiences like that, but I mean, I have to give it to Hegel, the way that he talked about things. It's not easy, it's not clear, it's not enjoyable per se, but I remember this one, I think it's paragraph 376 in the Phenomenology of Spirit in the Miller translation. The paragraphs are probably the same in all of them, but paragraph 376, I think, and it's talking about the merging of the high and low functions of the universe with the instrument of procreation and the instrument of urination. He's talking about how the same body parts can be used for, procreating and kind of showcasing the brilliance of humanity to duplicate itself, but then also it's a sign of our most base functions like urination. And he makes this super philosophic, and I was like, I didn't know you could do that in writing. It's so fascinating. So that has really stuck with me, and I go back and read that paragraph every once in a while, and it helps to have the context from what's coming before, as it always does with Hegel. But even on its own, I get this inkling of what it felt like. I remember going down to my parents, and I was just like giggling like a maniac, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And I mean, that's the moment when I knew I wanted to be a philosopher. So that is something that I'm incredibly indebted to, and that's the kind of experience that I really want my viewers to share as well. Which author, this is the 9th question, has given you the most profound ideas? Whew, that is a hard question right there. But I have to say Gilles Deleuze. Deleuze, just the way that he talks about things brings in a vast amount of fields, from anthropology to biology to sociology to psychoanalysis and psychology to philosophy to theology. All of this stuff comes together, and Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus are just like tour de forces of philosophy. I mean, they're so unique and were really transformative in the way I thought about philosophy. Really fundamentally cemented me in this kind of pure immanence approach that Deleuze really brings to the fore. His transcendental empiricism, I think, is really interesting. It's a very compelling kind of philosophical position. He's kind of a very interesting, almost like a neo-pragmatist kind of. His approach to religion, to idealism, to politics, to the state. It's all so interesting, and I think he's just given me so many profound, I mean, the formula pluralism equals monism in A Thousand Plateaus. Totally, it kept coming back to me, and it kept meaning more things than it did before, and I kept developing it. And I mean, I can remember my really formative moments of reading Deleuze and Guattari and kind of delving into their thought. And I should add that Guattari would also be kind of here with Deleuze. I remember kind of this process of I felt this affinity for them, and they were philosophers that I really felt like I could figure out, and they were calling to me to be interpreted. Some writers don't really, they say stuff on the page and you can tell they don't want you to take this further. But Deleuze and Guattari almost compel you to bastardize them. I think that's such a fascinating approach to writing. I think first off, it's a real destruction of the notion of authorial intention, and I think it's the most creative way to approach literature. I think something fundamentally undermining of the authorial position is exactly what we need to reach a totally kind of democratic approach to knowledge, to the freedom to learn and excite our minds. And I think Deleuze's work is just packed full of that. And I can keep coming back to it. It's some of my most successful content here on the channel, and it's the stuff that lots of other people are interested in. And it just continues to enthrall me. I know I could keep coming back to 1,000 Plateaus and, stealing some of these ideas of the assemblages, or, I don't know, the partial object from Anti-Oedipus, or, gosh, the regime of signs is a really interesting concept for me. Faciality, I really, really, really love. The order word, one of my favorite concepts in their linguistics. So many good concepts that I could ramble. I've got like 15 hours worth of lectures or something crazy like that here on the channel on Deleuze and Guattari. So the final question, which author do you think never wrote their masterpiece? Now, Reed Red rightly pointed out that this is a hard question, and I don't really know that I have a good answer here, but I have some kind of answer, which is Jean Baudrillard. Now, Baudrillard is a super interesting author, kind of has this strange mystique around him. I don't know a lot about him biographically. I think he kind of maintains that mystique. But the reason I say that Baudrillard didn't write his masterpiece, when I say that, someone might say, well, what about Simulacra and Simulation? That's his most famous work. Well, yeah, that is a masterpiece, but so is Symbolic Exchange and Death. So is Fatal Strategies. There's so many works that he's done that are basically equally as good as each other. I mean, those three that I just mentioned, I like them all equally, and I like them all in different respects for different reasons. In that sense, he hasn't written something where, like, Joyce, for example, wrote Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist, and he wrote Finnegan's Wake last, but Ulysses just stands above all those in terms of its success, historically speaking, literarily speaking, popularity speaking. That is kind of what I think of as a masterpiece. I think Finnegan's Wake is his masterpiece, but a lot of people will disagree with that for sure. But I don't think Baudrillard ever wrote a masterpiece, because I think his greatest works kind of are on equal playing fields with one another. So I think that Baudrillard didn't write a work that I think like, oh my gosh, that one is so much better than all the other ones. So maybe a bit of a reinterpretation of that question, but considering my previous thoughts about interpretation, maybe that's the best part about questions, is they entice you to answer them, but not exactly how to answer them. So that being said, that's it for this video. I know this is something a little bit different, but maybe some people will be interested in what I have to say. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I appreciate anyone who likes to help me with my literary endeavors. I try to give back the best I can, but no pressure to donate whatsoever. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.